The Spanish love a fiesta. Each year, throughout Spain's towns and villages, one fiesta celebrates the Iberian Peninsula's Moorish past. Townspeople dress as Moors or Christians, each trying to outdo the other in opulence and glamour. Whether the battles represent the Moors invading Spain in the 8th century or the Moors being kicked out in the Christian reconquest is sometimes unclear, at least to those taking part. But what is clear is the architectural legacy that the Moors left behind. Less well known is what else we have to thank the Moors for.
There are all kinds of things that we take for granted now in the West or in the modern world, which actually arrived through Moorish Spain. Everything from paper, cotton, oranges, lemons.
The Moors' legacy in medicine ranges from drinking lemon juice to the whole concept of what being a doctor is.
The Moors also brought with them astronomy, music, philosophy, physics and mathematics.
Medieval Western Christian mathematics would be inconceivable without what the Arabs transmitted to the West.
Like many people lured by the prospect of a too-good-to-be-true timeshare, the Moors first came to Spain by invitation. The Visigoth rulers of southern Spain were fighting among themselves, and one side asked the Moors to sail over from North Africa and help out. The Moors arrived and sorted out the argument, but they liked what they saw and didn't go back. In fact, a second 18,000-strong army soon came over and took Seville. And so it started. The Moors, who had embraced the new religion of Islam, began to put their stamp on Spain. Where there had been a Christian cathedral, they built a Muslim mosque. They did it in Seville, and further up the river in Córdoba, they did it in style.
The Arabs arrived at the beginning of the 8th century. Like all those who entered the city of Seville, the Arabs arrived in the city by coming up the river Guadalquivir. They came because it was the initial route followed by the expansion of Islam. Islam extended over much of the area that the Roman Empire had done.
There is little left of Moorish Seville, most of it obliterated by the twin demands of modern commerce and Christianity. Where there is now a Catholic church, there was once a mosque, and beneath that, often a previous church or synagogue, and sometimes a Roman temple.
The Moors built something which was completely their own, but incorporated all this stuff that they found around them. So you've got a kind of syncretic effect here, where people are building on top of things and they're borrowing stuff from what they find there, and each generation is producing something new.
The main Moorish relic is the Giralda, once the minaret of the mosque. Even then, only the lower part is original from the late 12th century and has been transformed into the cathedral bell tower.
The Giralda is typical of Seville and the history of Andalusia. The Roman feet cannot be separated from the Arab body and the Christian head. If the feet are separated from somebody's body, he cannot walk. If the body is taken away, he cannot live. And if the head is removed, he dies.
The site of the ancient mosque is occupied by a cathedral conceived in the 15th century. The church authorities wanted a building on so magnificent a scale that posterity will believe we were mad. It's another Christian monument that tells us as much as anything about Moorish Seville. The Alcázar is still a royal palace. General Franco was a frequent resident. What you see today is mainly from the Christian era, although the complex was first built by Moorish kings when Seville was briefly the capital of Andalusia. The Arab influence lasted in Seville long after the Arab rulers had gone. They left behind a tradition that appealed to the new Christian conquerors, and they especially left craftsmen who could continue that tradition. This work, carried out by Muslim artists under Christian direction, is called mudéjar.
When the land was recaptured, it was in the hands of the Muslims who served the Christian kings. These Christian kings were surprised by the architecture that the Muslims had created.
The mudéjar masterpiece in the Alcázar is the facade of Dom Pedro's palace, the archetype of a Moorish monument built for a Christian king. Christian motifs and coats of arms mix with texts from the Quran. The king had imported craftsmen from Granada and Toledo, reflecting the new ruler's fascination with his Islamic inheritance. In Moorish times, the river Guadalquivir was navigable up to Cordoba. And it wasn't long after the Moors took control that the centre of political power shifted upriver. Cordoba is now an unassuming Spanish provincial capital, but for a few decades it became the second city of Europe. And the glory of Cordoba was, and still is, its mosque, the Mezquita.
The mosque is one of the most amazing buildings in Moorish Spain. Architecturally, it's like a statement of what Moorish Spain was all about, because you've got building materials taken from Roman temples, from Visigothic churches. So they take all these bits and bobs and create something entirely new.
This model in the local museum shows the Mezquita at its completion in the 11th century. Then it had a seemingly endless parade of doorways open to the gardens outside and unobstructed views through the forest of internal columns.
It's the most important mosque in the city. People used to come here for the noon Friday prayers. It's a bit like going to a cathedral on Sunday. So you want to fit as many people in as possible.
The other thing which hits the visitor to the Mezquita is the row upon row of red and white arches. Dazzling, hypnotic, but very, very practical.
What you see in the mosque are the famous double arches. So you've got one arch and then another arch on top. This is in order to get a higher ceiling, because they were using old columns taken from the churches and temples that they found here, but they needed a higher ceiling than they could actually get with those columns. And that frees up space on the ground for all the worshippers.
The Mezquita, like most great buildings, wasn't the total product of one sudden flash of inspiration. It was extended and enlarged through generation after generation. Throughout this process, one sparkling jewel shines through, the mihrab. The mihrab is the focus of worship in a mosque. Here, framed by recycled Visigothic columns, the mihrab is, at its simplest, a niche in the wall indicating the direction of Mecca.
The rulers of Islamic Spain around the 10th century had a very strong sense of connection with Syria, their original homeland, where the conquerors of Spain came from in the 8th century. And they sought to evoke that family heritage by decorating the mihrab with glass mosaics, which evoked the glass mosaic decoration in places like the Damascus Mosque in Syria and the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. There are also inscriptions in gold, which evokes Quran pages, making the Quran a very special object.
But the Mezquita's function was not just religious.
The Mezquita is a unique building. It had the special function of being able to contain the complete town inside its walls. It was a building in which people not only came to pray, but also met to discuss political and economic matters. It was the place that received the message telling the troops to go off to war and telling them that the war was over.
With all that coming and going, the Moorish designers paid special attention to the entry points to the mosque.
The oldest one of those is called the doorway of the viziers. And what this did was it set the model for the later doorways that were built when the extensions to the mosque were being built. And what you've got is your central doorway where you've got a horseshoe arch. And if you look at the way the stripes are done, they don't just point to the center of that circular archway, they point down to the bottom. And that creates an effect like a rising sun or a setting sun. And then around that circular horseshoe archway, you've got a square frame, that's called an al-Fith. Arab architects love playing around with round forms and square forms and putting them together. Then on top of this al-Fith, you've got blind interlocking archways. And then right on the top, you've got these kind of battlements. And some people said it's to make the mosque like a fortress of faith.
Even at the peak of their power, some Arab rulers rejected the glorious entrances in favour of a modest side door. Islamic leaders often feared a violent end. So one built an arched walkway stretching across to the site of the ruler's palace, now the bishop's palace. He could then visit the mosque without bumping into would-be assassins. Put aside the glories of the mihrab or the red and white arches, an astonishing anomaly hits you full on. A Christian cathedral built inside a Moorish mosque. In one sense, it's a symbol of Christian triumphalism. In another, just the next round in a historical saga where Visigoth superseded Roman, Muslim built on Visigothic, and then Catholic replaced Islamic. Even in medieval times, this wasn't without controversy. The Emperor Charles V, who gave the go-ahead for the cathedral, was appalled by the result. He is said to have told the Catholic authorities, "You have taken something unique and replaced it with something that can be seen anywhere. But perhaps we should be grateful."
The mezquita is still standing due to the Christians' intervention. If they hadn't intervened, it could be in ruins or an abandoned building. The cathedral as a cathedral is an impressive piece of engineering work because it completely respects the proportions of the old mosque.
The traditional orange tree patio outside is still a lure for gossip and chit-chat. But where the arches were once open, they are now bricked in, and the pleas of modern Muslims for access to pray in the ancient mosque have been denied, a far cry from the height of Muslim power. This was the political and cultural high point of Moorish power in al-Andalus. The golden age stretched for most of the 10th century. The principal character was the Amir Abd al-Rahman III, whose victories against the Christians in the north earned him the title Al-Nasir the Victorious.
Abd al-Rahman III was actually a redhead and had a red beard because he was only a quarter Arab. His mother was from Navarre and his grandmother was from the north of Spain. So he actually had to dye his beard and his hair black in order to look more like an Arab, you see. He was worried that people weren't going to take him seriously.
He took himself seriously enough to assume the title Caliph, a matter of great significance in a competitive world. A Caliph was the messenger of God, or the messenger of the Prophet Mohammed, and supposedly divinely appointed. With this came the promise of an afterlife in paradise. But for Abd al-Rahman III, this wasn't enough. He built gardens to create a paradise on earth. The abundance of the Moorish gardens is still evident everywhere in Andalusia. Every alley is shaded by vines, every patio overflows with petals and leaves, and everywhere there is water, cooling the air as the water evaporates and refreshing the spirit. But if the Moors were good with horticulture, they excelled in agriculture.
There was a kind of green revolution here during the time that the Umayyads were in control here in Cordoba. There are all kinds of things that we take for granted now in the West or in the modern world, which actually arrived through Moorish Spain. Everything from oranges, artichokes, lemons, aubergines, rice as well. We've got hard wheat, the kind of wheat that you use for pasta. It grows much better in these dry conditions. It doesn't go off so easily. And it was largely to do with the improvement of the irrigation system here in Spain.
Even high in the Sierra Nevadas, they introduced agricultural irrigation on a grand scale, turning thousands of hectares of unproductive scrub into fertile farmland. Some of the Moors' original irrigation channels and pools are still in use today. So suitable are they that the only nod towards modern technology has been the replacement of sand dams by metal sluice gates. In Moorish times, the river Guadalquivir was deep and fast-flowing at Cordoba. Just downstream of the Roman bridge is the reconstructed Moorish water wheel. In Moorish times, a whole fleet of these wheels was spread across the river. The flow of the river turned the wheels, which filled and lifted the pots, which emptied into an aqueduct, which carried the water to the city. Sadly, the attraction of the earthenware pots for target practice has proved irresistible for Cordoba's youth. Only one lonely pot remains intact. Cordoba was not just an artistic and political centre, it was also a centre for industry and manufacture, and much of this work was carried out by the Jews. The old parts of the Andalusian towns all have their Jewish quarters, where streets are frequently named after the trades that flourished there. Under the Christian Visigoths, the Jews were very much bottom of the pile when riches and privileges were being shared out.
En el momento de la entrada de los árabes, los judíos ganaron.
At the time of the arrival of the Arabs, the Jews gained in status.
Unos aliados de la entrada de la tropa.
Consequently, they became allies of the entering Arab troops.
Una buena posición hasta al menos.
Throughout all the Middle Ages, they were in a good position until at least the 12th century, when the Crusades began in the whole of the Mediterranean.
It was not just the Jews and Christians who were second-class citizens under the Moors. Moorish women were also expected to defer. However, some exceptional Muslim women managed to struggle to the top. Lubna was a famed calligrapher and mathematician who lived in Cordoba in the 10th century. She was partly responsible for the most important centre of Moorish learning, the Caliphal Library of Al-Hakam II. A century later, the celebrated writer Walad al-Umayya rose to fame. She was famous for walking through the streets of Cordoba with her satirical poems embroidered on her clothes. In Granada, Hafsa al-Rakunaya was a well-respected poet and teacher who exerted great influence over the local rulers. At the same time in Seville, Fatima bint al-Mutana, philosopher, jurist and academic, was teacher to the great Moorish philosopher Ibn al-Arabi, a man who went on to influence the greatest of Moorish polymaths, Averroes.
Averroes is one of the intellectual giants of Cordoba. He was an astronomer, a jurist, a philosopher. He was also a physician, and he was also one of the counselors to the rulers here. And the interesting thing about Averroes is that he's actually better known in the West now than he is in the Islamic world, because he had a huge impact on the West philosophically, the work that he did trying to square the circle between faith and reason. How do you square up the fact that you've got, on the one hand, you're a Christian or you're a Muslim, so you believe that God created the world, and on the other hand, you're reading people like Aristotle, and you think, well, I can understand the world just by looking at it and observing it. So these two things didn't seem to square up.
Neither did the square peg of Averroes's thinking fit into the round hole of Muslim beliefs. Ultimately, Averroes fell out of favour and was ordered to stand at the mosque gate, where true believers could spit at him as they walked past. While the Muslim Averroes may not be more than just a street name now to many Spaniards, the effect he and his fellow polymaths had on the medicine of the time was enormous.
When the Moors invaded Spain, Christian medicine was effectively confined to a series of recipe books. Antidote is do-it-yourself medicine. There was very little understanding of the body. There was very little understanding of how drugs worked. There was a relatively small number of drugs used, relatively small number of surgical techniques.
Medically, Moorish Spain was streets ahead of the rest of Europe, and a lot of their medical knowledge came from the Greeks. But it was also work that they did themselves. They picked up the ball from people like Dioscorides and Galen, who they were translating, and they looked at, say, the medicinal properties of plants. They also developed all kinds of techniques to do with surgery. In fact, if you look in some of the museums here, they've got models of the surgical instruments that the Moors used to use, and they're not a million miles away from the surgical instruments being used even now.
The Moors introduced a whole variety of surgical techniques. It included, in particular, wound surgery, how to stuff your guts back and so that the patient would live. And when the Crusaders went to the Holy Land, they were amazed at the Muslim physicians because they were so good at dealing with wounds.
One of these doctors was Maimonides. He was the physician to the court of the Muslim leader Saladin. Maimonides was born in Cordoba to a Jewish family and learned his medicine from the ruling Moors. He went on to become one of the Middle Ages' leading philosophers and doctors. But not all the medical books were written by Spanish Moors. An enormous volume of knowledge was imported into Spain from the rest of the world.
The Moors in Spain had huge compendia, 10 times the size of what had previously been available in Western Europe. The canon of medicine of Avicenna, we would take probably a year to read it. It was so big. When the Christians reconquered Spain, they found a flourishing medical civilization, and they wanted to translate it for the benefit of those who didn't know Arabic but only knew Latin. And so in Spain were made the translations of the great books of Arabic medicine.
The Moors also brought other instruments, musical ones.
The influence that the Moors had on Spanish music can be dated back to the invention of musical notation in the 9th century by an Arab scholar, which then was imitated by the European scholars. The Moors brought several instruments into Spain, such as the rabab, bowed instrument, a little bit like the violin, as well as wooden flutes and double-reed shomes, and a lot of percussion. But the main instrument that was considered the king of instruments was the oud.
And the oud begat the lute, and the lute begat the guitar.
The modern guitar is created from the lute, and the lute originally had 4 strings, but there was a Baghdadi musician who came to Cordoba, and one of the things that he did was added a 5th string to the lute. Now, the original 4 strings were meant to represent the 4 classical humours, and what this chap did was he said, well, what's missing is the human heart, so he added a 5th string, and from then you get a 6th string added, and that's how the modern guitar is developed.
The guitar enabled the player to strum, whereas before we'd had the single line melody of the oud and the chordal soft harmony of the lute, whereas the guitar could introduce rhythm into the music.
While the guitar is the most famous instrument associated with the Moors, Spain is better known today for an original musical culture. Seville is a city once governed by the austere Almohads, who urged the destruction of musical instruments. Today, it's the city that in places like La Carboneria celebrates a musical heritage with its roots in Moorish Andalusia, flamenco.
Flamenco actually in Spanish just means Flemish or a flamingo. So there are all kinds of theories that maybe the movements of a flamingo-inspired flamenco dance. There's quite a debate as to what extent the Moors influenced flamenco. Flamenco is really a hodgepodge of all kinds of musical forms. You've got Byzantine influences, you've got North African influences, you've got Jewish influences, you've got Andalusian folklore, you've obviously got the gypsy influence as well. There are certain rhythms that you find in flamenco, like a 12-beat rhythm, which is very common in certain North African musical forms. How much of flamenco comes from the Moors, again, it's very difficult to say, but something is definitely there.
Flamenco may or may not trace its roots back to the Moors, but the high point of Islamic culture, the Golden Age, was in the 10th century, barely 200 years after the Moors arrived. This was when the ruler of Córdoba declared himself Caliph, God's representative, and he held sway over huge tracts of southern Spain. Abd al-Rahman III, the most powerful of Córdoba's rulers, made a bold attempt to establish the growing Moorish bureaucracy in one place. The needs of a steadily expanding population had outgrown Córdoba. So in about 936, the Caliph started to build his own new palace city from scratch on Córdoba's outskirts. He called it Medinat al-Zahra. The name is said to have been that of his favourite concubine, another of those comforting legends which the killjoys always doubt. What you see today may be only about 1/10 of the vast sprawl dominating the rolling countryside. Medinat al-Zahra was home to 20,000 officials on the government payroll. Building the city alone had taken up to a third of the state's annual budget. It was intended to impress, and it succeeded.
We've got certain accounts from the time of Christian diplomats, emissaries who came to Medinat al-Zahra, and they were just amazed by this fantastic city that he'd built. They built it in the same style as the mosque in Córdoba. So you've got, again, the horseshoe arch with the red and white stripes. It's like a logo for Moorish Spain at this time. You'll find it all over Spain, a bit like the golden arches of McDonald's or something like that. Well, they would use their horseshoe arch with the red and white stripes as their logo.
The surviving showpiece, built in 953, was the Salon Rico, where, under a trademark horseshoe arch, the Caliph held his official audiences. The star of the show was a nearby pool of mercury. Silver shafts of reflected sunlight flashed around the room when the slaves stirred it. What we see of the Salon Rico is the result of painstaking research. The archaeologists have been careful to reconstruct only what they know to be correct. One of the oddest sights at the Medinat al-Zahra is this lonely, reconstructed bath in the residential section. In those days, immersion baths were uncommon. In Jaén, there's a complete Moorish bath complex that has been uncovered and painstakingly restored. Here and elsewhere in Muslim Spain, the bath was really subsidiary to the mosque. It was chiefly used for ritual ablutions, and especially by men before the Friday prayers. People bathed by sloshing water over themselves and then steaming and drying. The baths were fed by a complex set of channels carrying the water from local hot springs. There are cool baths, warm baths, hot baths and dressing rooms, all beneath the 8-point star motif skylights, common in Moorish baths. The stars were an abiding passion for the Moors. They amassed a huge knowledge of astronomy. They also excelled at mathematics. Algebra is an Arabic word. With that and the understanding of geometry they'd rescued from the Greeks and a number system borrowed from India, they produced some remarkable results.
One of the best examples of what they have is the astrolabe, and I've got one here. This is a planispheric astrolabe, it's called. It's used for some basic mathematical activities like telling the time, but it does so without a mechanism, without clockwork. It does so by astronomical means, by measuring things in the sky, how high the sun or a star is above the horizon. And it has, on the back, it has a rule which has some holes in the end. And you can take the light of the sun coming through the tiny pinholes, and that will be used to work out how high the sun is above the horizon. And then you can locate it on the other side, where you have essentially a star map. And by turning this part around, locate where the sun is in the sky, or where a star is in the sky, and use that to give you the time. And a thing like this is intended to be used in different parts of the world, so it can be used in Mecca as well as in Spain.
But the golden age of al-Andalus was beginning to tarnish. The threats of Christian reconquerors and internal political struggles led the caliphate to crumble. Cordoba itself was infected by the chaos.
Because the caliphate itself had fallen into disrepute, things just started falling apart at the seams. They'd brought in a lot of mercenaries from North Africa, and they were stationed here in Cordoba, and they just went bananas. They started pillaging and looting and just marauding around the city, and things began to just fall apart. So eventually what happened was that various kingdoms started setting themselves up within Moorish Spain. People started breaking away from the political center here in Cordoba, and even little villages would just suddenly start up and say, well, actually we're a kingdom now, and they just break away from Cordoba.
One by one, Seville, Cordoba and the upstart new kingdoms all fell to the Christians. The story of Al-Andalus ends in Granada, with the dynasty who left behind an enduring monument to Arabic culture, the Alhambra. The Nasrids were the last Islamic dynasty in Al-Andalus. Their first monarch, Mohammed I, built his impregnable hilltop fort after taking Granada from various warring factions in 1237. There had been fortresses here before, and he surrounded the Alhambra with a huge protecting wall.
It was a bloody time in 13th, 14th, 15th century Spain. You had to be tough to survive. There was the threat from the Christian monarchs to the north. There was also sometimes a threat from the Marinid sultans in Morocco. It was also a time of considerable economic hardship. And of course, in the 14th century, this is when the Black Death strikes and it ravages the economy of Granada.
But amid all the bloodshed arose a building of amazing beauty. The palace complex is entered through the Cuarto Dorado, with its richly patterned back-walled and wooden beams.
The materials in the Alhambra create this lace-like effect, which seems a little bit like the icing on a cake. But actually the materials, plaster, are quite cheap materials. And it's because the Nasrid rulers who built the Alhambra were very weak politically, and economically their situation wasn't very good, so they made the best of what they had.
The two doors were intended to confuse. The left one leads to the palace proper. The right one took would-be assassins down a series of blind alleys. That's the story anyhow. And maybe there's a grain of truth in it. After all, the king who built this, Mohammed V, was found floating face down in one of the palace pools. One of the oldest surviving parts of the complex, the Partal Palace, is early 14th century. Overlooked by the Torre de las Damas, this area was once richly decorated, but the Torre had private owners in the 19th century, and their interior decorators managed to destroy much of what was worthwhile.
The Court of the Myrtles looks approximately as it did in the 14th century, with one important exception. Those box hedges that rise to obscure your view wouldn't have been like that at the time. They would have had the myrtles there, but it would have been a sunken beds of myrtles. The thing you've got to remember about the Alhambra is you mustn't just walk around it blonk, blonk, blonk. What you've got to do is sit down. The architects actually designed all the windows very low. They designed the views to be seen from a position of sitting on the floor.
The pivotal point of the Alhambra is the Lion Court, right in the middle. It's in turns beautiful and moving, sitting proudly on the cover of every tourist guide and brochure. But we still don't know exactly what its function was. It might have been political, might have been religious. Most likely, it was the customary mix of the two.
Lions were a very strong symbol of royalty and authority since ancient times. And many ancient rulers had lions, real and sculptured, under their thrones or associated with their palaces. In the Court of the lions in the fountain very much evoke the royalty and power of the Nasrid rulers.
It's long been thought that the Lion Court was the private palace of the Nasrid sultans, where he kept his harem. It was a place of voluptuous luxury. I think not. I think, in fact, the Court of the Lions, though it doesn't look it, was actually a religious training college. It looks like a lavishly decorated palace, but that's the way religious training colleges of the same period in Morocco look. As you walk around the Alhambra today, it looks really rather pleasantly sandstone, and the Court of the Lions has been compared to a Zen Buddhist rock garden. It looks so austere. But at the time, in the 14th century, everywhere was lavishly, luridly painted, making it look much more like a Disneyland palace. But there would be textiles everywhere. There'd be textiles on the ground, there'd be textiles hanging out of the windows, and there'd be textiles veiling the doors.
One of the arts of the Nasrid period in Spain was silk textile production, and the designs on the textiles very much evoke the designs on architecture in the Alhambra.
As you walk into these courtyards, you see this fantastically elaborate stucco and tile work. At first, the eye can't really take it in. Indeed, even once you've looked at it for hours, the brain still can't take in the fantastic elaboration of the decoration here. The decoration is compounded of three elements. There's geometrical decoration employing stars and squares. Then there's arabesque or atarique decoration, the use of elaborate coiling vegetation. And then intertwining with this, you get calligraphic decoration. The calligraphy is very important in the Alhambra. Large parts are one big stone book, and he who can read it will take messages from it.
Messages were also sent in the elaborate decorations seen in the rooms off the courts. In the salon of the ambassadors, the heavens were represented in the ceilings. And to drive the message home, the Sultan had his throne set into this niche. All those who looked at him were dazzled by the sunlight streaming in through the window behind.
It was a fairly hedonistic kind of place, and you sort of get the feeling that they knew that they were at an end of an era. They used quite a lot of hashish, they drank quite a lot of alcohol. This is obviously banned officially in Islam, but they seem to turn a bit of a blind eye to it. And also some of the kings of Moorish Granada were quite famous for, let's say, if you owed the king some money, maybe you could just, a few sexual favors and he turned a blind eye to all the money that you owed him, that kind of stuff. So they were indulging in all kinds of vices, and it was really a sort of a Las Vegas of Europe at the time.
it wasn't just the rulers who became a little lax in observing Islamic law. The rulers' wives were not all pillars of probity. The trunk of this old yew tree, which grew in the Sultana's patio in the Alhambra, is preserved because legend has it that at night the Sultana, who was safely upstairs behind locked doors, would encourage young men to climb the yew and enter her apartments from the overhanging boughs. Before dawn, the young men would descend by the same route. But all good things must come to an end. In 1492, the Christian armies of Ferdinand and Isabella took Granada.
In the end, I suppose the Reconquista was able to draw on much larger resources. It wasn't just Christian Spaniards fighting against the Moors, it was also French and English volunteers flooded to join the Reconquista. And slowly, Christian military technology, gunpowder technology, overtakes that of the Muslims.
One of the gates of the Alhambra, the Puerta de la Justicia, bears a graphic illustration of an old belief that turns out to have been untrue. The saying was that when the hand of Fatima grasps the key, the Alhambra will fall. But although the reconquerors placed a Christian icon between Fatima's hand and the key, it's still beyond her grasp. The reconquering Christians were fond of stamping their victory over the signs of Islam. In Seville, they built the world's biggest Gothic church on top of a mosque, erected a Christian palace on top of a Moorish one. In Córdoba, they built a cathedral inside the mosque, erected a Christian palace on top of the Moorish Alcázar. But in Granada, they were far less destructive.
When Ferdinand and Isabella walk into the Alhambra in 1492, flushed with victory, they look around it. The place is really shabby, it's really run down. But unexpectedly, for such militant Catholic monarchs, were really very Moorish in their tastes for gardens, inner living costumes. And the first thing they do is they get Muslim craftsmen in to repair the place and to restore it to its former glory. Charles V, similarly, their grandson, when he comes here, he says, God, this place is a knockout, and he does a lot to keep it standing. I know he demolishes a bit to make room for his own palace, but he nevertheless is one of the people who is responsible for the survival of this palace.
Charles built his own palace in the Alhambra in 1526, partly paid for by a special tax on Muslims. He wasn't just influenced by triumphalism. He's said to have got fed up with the cold and the damp of the original Alhambra, and he wanted something with more mod cons. The result has earned a grudging praise, although Charles himself never got the benefit, as he left Granada shortly after commissioning the palace and didn't go back. His grandparents, however, were there to stay. While Ferdinand and Isabella were prepared to enjoy many aspects of Islamic culture, they were not prepared to put up with any religion other than Catholicism. Convert or go was the message, and the Spanish Inquisition ensured conversion was total.
They would pick up people on all kinds of silly little things. In the later period, they'd pick up Moors for eating couscous, for example. This was seen as being incredibly heretical, obviously a sign that you're a closet Muslim and you hadn't really converted to Catholicism. Olive oil was seen as a really bad thing as well, because true Christians cook with butter and only dodgy Arabs cook with olive oil. This is totally crazy. I mean, obviously, olive oil, thankfully, is one of the things that survived the Inquisition.
Having supervised the last stages of the reconquest of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella then set their minds to foreign conquest. They bankrolled a young man called Cristobal Colón. We know him better as Christopher Columbus. The riches that Columbus brought back from the New World were all channeled through Seville. Once again, the Moorish heritage came in useful. The Moors had built a tower on each side of the river, between which barriers could be lowered to block the river and protect the city. Ferdinand and Isabella adapted one of these towers to become the receiving house and strong room for all the gold coming from the Americas, hence its name, the Torre del Oro. Columbus himself resides less than a kilometre away, in a lofty tomb within the cathedral that his wealth helped to support. However, the wealth of Spain was not to last.
A lot of Moors stayed in Spain for another 100 years or so, and they didn't actually leave until 1609, which is when they were kicked out by the King Philip III. And ironically, what happened was that the Spanish economy nosedived as a result, because the Moors, or the moriscos, they had a huge amount of technical know-how, particularly agricultural. And they were the ones who controlled all the irrigation systems. They were the ones who knew how the crops that the Moors had introduced, how to plant them and how to cultivate them and all this kind of stuff. And there used to be a saying, actually, whoever has Moors working for them, they're worth their weight in gold.
But in a way, the Moors never left Spain. There's still a sense of the souk in the narrow streets where Moorish products are sold. Arabic tea is still sold in the shadow of the Christian church. And less than a kilometre from the Alhambra, across the River Darro, the first new mosque in Spain for 500 years has recently opened. While renewed tension rises between Christian and Muslim, the modern mosque has been built on a hillside overlooking the Alhambra. The few worshippers and their religious leaders face all the hostility engendered by the Madrid train bombings and the suggestion that Al-Qaeda covets some sort of resurrection of al-Andalus in modern Spain.
All of that talk about al-Andalus is nonsense. History is history, and they are very serious to be dreaming about what happened 500 years ago. If Muslims got to contribute something to our time and to our fellow human beings, it has to be done in this age and facing the many, many challenges and problems of this age. And dreaming about lost glories of past civilizations is just wasting time. In a way, the Muslims are less romantic about our historic Islamic past than some of the Christians. There are foundations and clubs and cultural associations to revive the heritage of al-Andalus, and they are all Christian. They are not Muslim.
The closest that most Spaniards get to their Moorish culture is the Moors and Christians fiestas. Half the town will get dressed up as Moors and they'll wear feathers in their hair and all kinds of stuff. It's fantastic. And then the other half of the town will be dressed as Christians and they're all a bit sort of more serious and sour looking. And that really is what it's all about for a lot of people. They may come and visit the mosque, they may go to the Alhambra, and it's a kind of Disneyfication almost of the Moorish past taking place here. So it doesn't really go underneath the surface.